Doing some work on the 80 tonight. Got a clunking noise in my drive shaft. I'm going to talk to you guys about this here in just a second and show you a fix for it. Just remember, whenever separating your drive shafts, to mark them. That way you can put them back the way they're supposed to be. And just a quick note, the rear drive shaft is actually supposed to be out of phase. Alright, so 80 series drive shaft clunks. I chased this for probably the better part of a year. Replaced all the bushings in my suspension thinking that it was something with the suspension until I found out it was my drive shaft. So after replacing the front and rear joints on the U-joints on the shaft, I took this apart, cleaned all the splines out, greased it the proper way. By the way, if you put too much grease in here, you'll actually hydrolock the shaft and you'll make the vibration and noise worse. Usually the best way to do this is clean all the grease out of the splines and then paint them on with an acid brush. You can use the grease fitting that's on the yoke, but you have to be careful on how much you actually pump into the yoke itself. The splines fit so tightly that it'll actually hold all the grease in like a big wad up here, and it doesn't let the slip yoke actually function. So after doing all that with mine and still chasing the clunking noise, I discovered that the grease that I was using, which is regular grease that you'd use for a shaft like this, was not enough to take up the tolerances. Now the shaft may be slightly worn. I mean, the truck does have 250 some thousand miles on it and it's 25 years old. You can buy a new shaft and they'll correct the problem, but the solution I have is a little bit cheaper, actually a lot cheaper. So what I do is use a different type of lubricant, and this looks like anti-seize, but it's not. It's actually Mercedes-Benz starter gear lube lubricant, and that's the part number. So you get some on your brush, and then you basically paint it onto the splines, and it's a very, very thick grease. And you do that all the way around. Alright, so I've got the shaft lubed up, and as you can see, I put a very liberal coating on it. Make sure that you use enough. And the final thing I do before I put the drive shaft back in is I come up to the yoke that's still attached to the transfer case, and I paint the inside of that as well. That way we make sure that it gets all the way through the splines. Alright, so one other thing I want to mention here is when you're putting this shaft back together, it's not going to want to compress because of how thick this grease is, and there's nowhere for the air to go. So if you take a screwdriver and press in on the end of this grease zerk fitting, it'll allow the air to escape while you compress it. And you want to make sure that you compress this shaft all the way as far as it'll go, and then release from the grease zerk, and then you can pull it back to the differential. Make sure you tighten these bolts by hand, because the last thing you want to do is be on the trail broken down fighting 600 foot-pounds of torque on those bolts laying in the mud. So again, if you're hearing a clunk noise when you accelerate from a complete stop and it sounds like a suspension component, you might want to call your Mercedes-Benz dealer and get some of that grease right there. By the way, if you guys have any questions regarding these, feel free to direct message us, drop us a message on Facebook, Instagram, we have a YouTube channel, and I'll try to answer them as best I can.